Tonight, we're talking about one of the most controversial documents in modern UFO disclosure. Not a blurry video, not a leaked photograph, not an anonymous internet rumor. A memo, a document that allegedly records a conversation between a senior Pentagon official, a respected government scientist, and claims involving a deeply hidden UFO program buried inside the American defense system. This is the story of the Wilson Memo, a document that, if genuine, suggests something extraordinary. That sometime in the late 1990s, a high-ranking Pentagon insider may have discovered evidence of a deeply compartmentalized program involving recovered technology, and then found himself denied access. Denied, not because the program didn't exist, but because he supposedly lacked the authorization to know about it. Think about that for a moment. An admiral, a former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, a man connected to some of the highest levels of military intelligence in the United States government, allegedly told, "You don't have the need to know." That idea sits at the center of the Wilson Memo mystery, and for years the document was dismissed, ignored, mocked, treated as fringe speculation, until something changed. Names connected to the memo kept reappearing around modern disclosure. David Grusch, Eric Davis, special access programs, crash-retrieval allegations, compartmentalized secrecy. Suddenly, people started asking whether the Wilson Memo wasn't just another UFO rumor, but perhaps an early glimpse into the exact hidden system whistleblowers are talking about today. Tonight, we break down who Admiral Thomas Wilson was, how the memo surfaced, what it allegedly says, why the claims matter, and why this document continues to haunt the disclosure conversation decades later. Because whether the memo is true, partially true, or completely false, it reveals something very important. The structure of secrecy people believe exists around the UFO phenomenon. And maybe, even more importantly, how power really works inside the national security world. This is UFO to UAP The Disclosure Report. I am your host, Matt Tones, and today's episode is titled The Wilson Memo. Did a Pentagon Admiral discover a secret UFO program? Please subscribe and share the episode. Before we go further, we need to understand something important. The Wilson Memo is not an official Pentagon release. It has never been authenticated publicly by the United States government. There is no official statement confirming the events described inside it occurred exactly as written. That matters. And throughout this episode, we're going to separate claims, allegations, evidence, and speculation, because that distinction matters now more than ever. But here's why the Wilson Memo became impossible to ignore. The people connected to it are real, not random internet personalities, not anonymous message board users, real officials, real scientists, real intelligence figures, and that changes the conversation entirely. The central figure in this story is Admiral Thomas Wilson, a career military officer, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, a man deeply embedded within the American intelligence and defense structure. Wilson held positions involving military intelligence, strategic operations, classified programs, and national security oversight. This was not a marginal figure. This was someone operating near the core of the Pentagon system. According to the story surrounding the memo, Wilson became interested in UFO-related programs after briefings connected to military and intelligence discussions during the 1990s. At that time, interest in unidentified aerial phenomena was beginning to circulate quietly among certain defense and intelligence circles. Not publicly, not politically, internally, especially after repeated military encounters involving unusual radar tracks, aerospace anomalies, and classified reporting channels. According to the allegations, Wilson eventually learned about a deeply hidden special access program tied to recovered technology. And this is where the story becomes explosive. To understand why, we need to understand what a special access program actually is, or an SAP. You've heard us discuss special access programs before on this show, but this story depends on understanding how compartmentalization works. Most people imagine classified information as one giant vault, but the reality is far more fragmented. Inside the national security world, information is divided into layers and then subdivided again. Access is not simply about rank, it's about authorization, compartmentalization, operational necessity, and need to know. That phrase matters, need to know, because according to the Wilson Memo, that phrase became the barrier that stopped a senior Pentagon insider from going further. Some special access programs are so restricted that even highly cleared officials allegedly cannot access them without being specifically read into the compartment. That's how hidden programs remain hidden, even inside the government itself. And critics of the modern disclosure movement often overlook this point. They assume if UFO programs existed, everybody important would know. But that's not how compartmentalization works. In theory, a deeply buried program could exist inside layers of private contracting structures, defense compartments, and restricted oversight systems without broad awareness across government. That idea forms the backbone of the Wilson Memo narrative. Now, let's talk about how the memo itself appeared. The document surfaced publicly years later after allegedly being stored among papers connected to astrophysicist Eric Davis. Davis is an important figure here because he is not just another UFO commentator. He worked around advanced aerospace concepts and had associations with defense related research environments. His name repeatedly appears around AAWSAP, advanced propulsion discussions, and government-connected UFO investigations. The memo itself allegedly documents a conversation between Davis and Admiral Wilson, a conversation said to have taken place in 2002. Inside the memo, Wilson allegedly describes attempting to investigate a deeply hidden program connected to recovered technology. According to the document, Wilson learned about the program through defense channels and eventually traced it to a private aerospace contractor. He allegedly contacted the program managers seeking access, and according to the memo, they refused him. Imagine that scene: a Pentagon insider, an admiral, demanding answers and being told you are not authorized. The implications of that claim are enormous, because if true, it would suggest not only the existence of hidden programs, but programs operating beyond conventional oversight. That is exactly why the Wilson memo became legendary in disclosure circles, not because it proves aliens, but because it describes a hidden architecture of secrecy, and for many people, that feels disturbingly plausible. But there's another reason this memo gained traction: the timeline. Years later, modern whistleblowers will begin describing systems that sound remarkably similar: compartmentalized programs, restricted access, private contractor control, legacy retrieval operations. The overlap between the Wilson memo allegations and later disclosure narratives is impossible to ignore. That does not prove the memo is true, but it explains why interest exploded again after the Grusch revelations. Suddenly, people asked, was this document an early warning? Did someone already try to expose the system years before the public was ready to listen? Or is the entire thing an elaborate mythology built around intelligence culture and secrecy itself? That question remains unresolved. But one thing is certain: The Wilson Memo changed the disclosure conversation forever. Next, we're going deeper into what the memo actually alleges: the claimed crash retrieval connection, the aerospace contractor mystery, and why some researchers believe the document may describe the hidden center of the UFO secrecy system itself. According to the Wilson memo, the story becomes stranger the deeper Admiral Wilson allegedly went, because this wasn't simply a classified aerospace project, at least not according to the claims. The memo alleges Wilson discovered a deeply buried program hidden within layers of contractor secrecy, not publicly visible, not acknowledged, and allegedly protected by extraordinary compartmentalisation. But here's the detail that changed everything. According to the document, the program managers supposedly told Wilson they were attempting to reverse engineer recovered technology. Recovered. That word sits at the center of the entire controversy. Recovered from where? Recovered from what? The memo itself allegedly implies the technology was not simply advanced human engineering, and that single implication is why the Wilson memo became explosive inside disclosure circles, because now the conversation was no longer about sightings, not radar, not lights in the skies, not pilot encounters. Now the allegation involved physical technology, hidden programs, and possible crash retrieval operations. And this is the point where the Wilson memo intersects directly with modern disclosure claims, because decades later, David Grusch would publicly allege the existence of crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs tied to non-human technology. Again, that does not prove the memo is authentic, but the overlap between the allegations is impossible to ignore. And that overlap is exactly why interest in the Wilson memo exploded again in recent years. Now, according to the alleged conversation, Wilson supposedly discovered the hidden program through references buried inside special access program oversight structures. But when he attempted to investigate further, he encountered resistance. Not subtle resistance, direct resistance. According to the memo, the contractor representatives allegedly questioned why Wilson was looking into the program at all. Think about how extraordinary that is if true. An admiral, a former DIA director, allegedly being interrogated by private program managers over his attempt to access information. And according to the story, the situation escalated. Wilson allegedly threatened to expose the issue through official channels, but the response he supposedly received was chilling. The managers allegedly warned him pursuing the matter further could damage his career. Again, none of this has been officially verified, but this is why the memo captured attention, because it paints a picture of a hidden world where private contractors, compartmentalized programs, and buried oversight systems may operate with extraordinary autonomy. That possibility deeply unsettles people, especially when you consider how modern defense contracting actually works. Today, vast portions of advanced aerospace development occur inside private industry. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Boeing, massive corporations deeply intertwined with defense infrastructure, national defense infrastructure. These companies handle advanced weapons, stealth systems, classified aerospace research, and restricted military technologies. And importantly, private contractors operate differently from government agencies. That distinction matters enormously because once programs move into contractor environments, layers of public visibility begin disappearing. Oversight becomes more fragmented, access becomes more restricted, and compartmentalization becomes easier to maintain. This is one reason the Wilson Memo narrative feels plausible to many researchers, not because it proves hidden UFO programs exist, but because the structural framework itself already exists. That's important. People often confuse plausibility with proof. The Wilson Memo is not proof of recovered alien technology, but it describes a secrecy architecture many believe could theoretically conceal extraordinary programs. And perhaps more importantly, it reflects how deeply hidden modern special access programs can become. Now, there's another aspect of the Wilson Memo that deserves attention: the emotional tone. Because according to people who support the memo's authenticity, Wilson allegedly sounded frustrated, angry, disturbed by what he encountered, not because he confirmed extraterrestrials, but because he supposedly discovered a system operating beyond expected oversight boundaries. That idea sits at the center of many disclosure fears. Not simply are UFOs real, but who controls the information? And perhaps even more unsettling, has secrecy evolved beyond democratic accountability itself? Those are dangerous questions because once public trust begins eroding around transparency, everything becomes unstable. And this is why the Wilson Memo matters even to skeptics. Even if the document were ultimately false, it still reveals the shape of modern public anxiety surrounding hidden systems. People increasingly believe parts of government operate beyond visibility. Corporations possess extraordinary classified capabilities, and compartmentalization prevents meaningful oversight. The Wilson Memo became symbolic of that fear. But there's another layer here, one that makes this story even stranger. The memo doesn't simply describe hidden technology. It allegedly describes a failed attempt to understand it. That distinction matters enormously. According to the claims, the contractor representatives supposedly admitted they struggled to reverse engineer the recovered material, meaning even if the allegations were true, humanity may not actually understand the technology involved. And this is where the story shifts from conspiracy into something more existential, because now we're no longer talking about hidden weapons. We're talking about the possibility of technology fundamentally beyond current human understanding. Again, that remains unverified, but it explains why crash retrieval narratives became so psychologically powerful, because they tap into something deeper than secrecy. They tap into the idea that humanity may have encountered something ahead of us, something we cannot fully comprehend. And whether true or false, that idea reshapes how people think about the phenomenon. Now, naturally, critics have raised major objections to the Wilson Memo, and those objections matter. Some argue the memo lacks authentication. The formatting is questionable, the chain of custody is weak, and there is no definitive evidence proving the conversation occurred exactly as written. Others point out that intelligence communities are filled with rumor, speculation, and disinformation, and that is absolutely true. The national security world is not clean. It is layered with compartmentalization, internal politics, misinformation, counterintelligence, and competing agendas. That environment creates ambiguity constantly, which means caution matters and intellectual honesty matters. The Wilson memo should not be treated as confirmed fact, but it also cannot be casually dismissed anymore. Not after modern disclosure developments revive many of the same themes independently. That is why the memo continues to survive decade after decade, because the broader disclosure movement eventually caught up to its allegations. And perhaps that's the strongest part of this entire story. The memo appeared years before Grusch, Arrow, congressional hearings, and mainstream UAP disclosure. At the time, many people laughed at it. But modern events changed the context. Now, when people read the memo, they see echoes of crash retrieval claims, hidden special access program structures, private contractor secrecy, and denied access narratives. That doesn't validate the document, but it changes how it is perceived. Now, imagine for a moment that some version of the Wilson memo story is true. Not necessarily every detail, not necessarily extraterrestrials, but the core structure. A hidden compartment, restricted oversight, technology buried inside contractor systems. If something like that existed, how would the public ever discover it? Think about that carefully. Not through ordinary channels, not through press releases, not through traditional transparency mechanisms, but deeply compartmentalized systems are specifically designed to resist exposure. That's their purpose. And the realization leads directly into the next phase of the disclosure conversation. Because if the Wilson memo describes the architecture correctly, then modern whistleblowers may not simply be exposing secrets. They may be colliding with an entire hidden structure designed to prevent full visibility. And that possibility changes everything. Because now the question is no longer, is there a secret? Now the question becomes, how would anyone ever prove it exists? And next, we will explore the biggest mystery surrounding the memo itself. Why nobody has been able to fully verify it, fully debunk it, or even make it disappear. Most conspiracy stories eventually collapse. The evidence falls apart, the witnesses disappear, the claims unravel under scrutiny. But the Wilson memo is different because decades later, it still exists in a strange state between credibility, uncertainty, and mystery. Never fully proven, never fully debunked, and somehow still connected to the center of the modern disclosure conversation. That is extremely unusual because normally documents this controversial either become authenticated or disappear into irrelevance. The Wilson memo did neither. Instead, it lingered quietly for years, for decades. The modern disclosure brought it back from the dead, and suddenly people started asking, why does this document keep resurfacing around serious disclosure figures? One reason is the people connected to it. Eric Davis never publicly declared the memo fake. That matters, but he also never fully authenticated it publicly in a definitive official sense. That ambiguity became part of the mystery itself. Then there's Admiral Wilson. Wilson has publicly denied aspects of the story, but even those denials became controversial because disclosure researchers argued his response sounded careful, measured, restricted, not explosive, not aggressive. Again, that does not prove anything, but intelligence culture, ambiguity itself often becomes fuel for speculation. And that is exactly what happened here. Then came congressional disclosure, whistleblowers, public hearings, David Grusch. Suddenly, themes once considered fringe were appearing in mainstream political discussion. Crash retrievals, legacy programs, compartmentalized secrecy, restricted oversight, private contractor involvement, and people who had ignored the Wilson memo for years suddenly revisited it with fresh eyes because the overlap was difficult to dismiss. The memo now appeared less isolated, less random, less disconnected from broader disclosure narratives. Again, that still does not prove the claims, but it changed the atmosphere around the document completely. Now, here's where things become psychologically fascinating. The Wilson memo survives because it sits perfectly inside uncertainty, too specific to ignore, too unverified to confirm, and that combination creates something powerful. Mystery, not fantasy, mystery. The memo contains names, structures, bureaucratic details, intelligence terminology, and realistic compartmentalization logic. It sounds believable enough to feel possible, but remains unverified enough to avoid closure. That unresolved tension is exactly why the story refuses to disappear, because humans are deeply uncomfortable with incomplete narratives. We want certainty, especially around subjects involving power and secrecy. But the Wilson Memo never gives certainty, only possibility. And possibility is sometimes more psychologically powerful than proof itself. There's another reason this story persists. It reflects something people increasingly suspect about the modern world, that enormous systems may exist beyond ordinary visibility, not necessarily UFO systems, just hidden systems in general, classified networks, restricted programs, corporate state partnerships, compartmentalized structures operating quietly beneath public awareness. The Wilson Memo became symbolic of that fear, because even outside the UFO issue, modern governments already operate through hidden intelligence structures, classified military projects, covert operations, and black budget environments. That is not conspiracy theory, that is historical reality. And once people understand that, the idea of additional hidden compartments becomes easier to imagine. And again, imagination is not evidence, but understanding how secrecy works changes what people consider plausible. Now let's consider another difficult question. Could the Wilson Memo itself be disinformation? That possibility absolutely exists. In intelligence environments, disinformation is real. Narratives are shaped intentionally. Information is leaked strategically. False trails are sometimes introduced, and controversial subjects become fertile ground for confusion. So, yes, it is entirely possible the memo could represent misinformation, partial truth mixed with fiction, or even an intentional narrative operation. And serious researchers acknowledge that possibility, but even that creates another layer of mystery. Because if the memo were disinformation, why create it? What purpose would it serve? To distract? To confuse? To hide another program? To seed mythology around classified aerospace projects? Again, there are no definitive answers, and that is the point. Every direction leads back into uncertainty. This is why the Wilson Memo sits in a unique category with UFO history. It is not just a UFO story, it is a story about access, secrecy, power, and the architecture of hidden knowledge. That's why it continues to resonate, because at its core, the memo asks a terrifying question. What if there are compartments inside the national security system so deeply buried that even senior officials cannot penetrate them? That possibility fundamentally changes how people think about government itself. And whether true or false, that idea now exists permanently inside public consciousness. Now, there's one final aspect of the Wilson Memo people often overlook: the emotional implication. Because if some version of the story were true, then the people allegedly running these programs may not fully understand the technology either. Think about that. Not evil masterminds hiding total answers, but human beings confronting something beyond their comprehension, trying to contain it, trying to study it, trying to reverse engineer something fundamentally unfamiliar. That possibility is strangely human, and honestly, far more believable than simplistic conspiracy fantasies, because reality is usually messier than fiction. Confused people, fragmented systems, partial understanding, conflicting agendas that feel much closer to how real institutions operate. And maybe that's why the Wilson Memo continues to survive. Not because it proves aliens, not because it confirms crash retrievals, but because it feels structurally possible inside the world we already know exists. A world of special access programs, hidden compartments, defense contractors, and restricted oversight. The memo simply pushes those reality one step further into territory the public cannot verify and perhaps was never supposed to see. So, where does that leave us? The Wilson Memo remains unresolved. No definitive proof, no definitive debunking, only a document sitting at the intersection of secrecy, disclosure, and the possibility that parts of the UFO mystery may exist far deeper inside hidden systems than the public realizes. And maybe that uncertainty is the most important part of all, because the Wilson Memo forces us to confront something uncomfortable, not just whether UFO secrets exist, but whether modern secrecy itself has evolved beyond public visibility. That question may ultimately matter far more than the memo, because if hidden compartments can operate beyond oversight, then the real mystery is no longer just the phenomenon. The real mystery becomes who actually controls the truth. This has been UFO to UAP, the Disclosure Report. Thank you for tuning in. Please share the episode and don't forget to tell your mom.